We go. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our discussion this morning on doing digital inclusion with limited resources. We've got an hour scheduled in for this, but I figure it's only probably going to take us 45 minutes. But if it doesn't, don't hold me to that and don't come for me at the end, but I'll do my best. So like I said, the webinar will be recorded. We'll switch the recording off when we get to the end and do a little bit of Q&A, just so we've got that safe space to kind of have an open discussion with each other that won't be available later on YouTube. As we go through, if you've got any questions or thoughts, please feel free to stick them in the Zoom chat and we can grab them later and have a discussion on them. But I think that's pretty much all of the housekeeping. Just a brief introduction. So for anyone that doesn't know me, my name's Jason. I'm one of the Digital Inclusion Development Officers here at SCVO. Working with the digital inclusion team. I'm joined by my colleague Darren. Darren, if you want to say hello.
Morning, everybody. I'm just Jason's wingman for today.
No. Lucky Darren has a whole day of Jason ahead of him, so I know we all wish we were in the same boat. Yeah, so the digital inclusion team at SCVO works with organizations, not just in the voluntary sector, but across different sectors as well, helping to understand those issues around digital inclusion and kind of reinforcing that message that digital inclusion is everyone's responsibility. So if it's everyone's responsibility, how do we help people to kind of fulfill that responsibility and support people? SCVO, for anyone that doesn't know, is the national membership body for Scotland's voluntary sector. So charities, social enterprises, organisations that do good, effectively. We provide a lot of support and services and resources for organisations working in the voluntary sector. So without further ado, let's kick off. The first thing really is just getting a sense of who's in the room. So just using the Zoom chat, if you want to stick your name, your organisation, and why you're here today in the chat, that gives us a really good indication of who we're reaching and how we're helping. But just while you're doing that, I thought I'd give a bit of an overview of what it is that we're going to talk about today. So there's kind of three key learning outcomes from today. The first is really, how can digital inclusion projects succeed in difficult circumstances? So we are in the midst of a cost of living crisis, a running cost crisis, all sorts of crises. How can we continue to do good digital inclusion work when things are tight? Secondly, we want to look at the role of collaboration. So why is collaboration important in all sorts of community work, but particularly digital inclusion work? And lastly, it's kind of a wordy one. How can we develop practical actions and strategies to promote digital inclusion with limited resources? So really, what are those practical hints and tips in terms of getting that kind of immediate impact and short-term wins? So that's going to be our focus today, and hopefully we'll all feel a bit better about these three things by the end. But just before we begin, I really wanted to bring attention to the fact that SCVO advocates for fair funding for the voluntary sector in Scotland. So today, when we're talking about doing digital inclusion with limited resources, we're coming at it from the point of view of recognising that it's a really, really difficult funding environment for organisations right now. This isn't about us trying to undervalue the really vital and important work that organisations like you are doing. We just feel really passionately that where possible, we need to keep fighting for digital inclusion as a priority. So it's not us saying you need to be providing digital inclusion services for free and you shouldn't pay your staff. It's just, what can we do and what can we think about practically right now to make sure that we continue to provide really good services when we're talking about digital inclusion? So just to kind of kick us off, thinking about the current environment and setting a little bit of context. Now, I will warn you, this slide is a little bit depressing, but it does all get a little bit more uplifting from here on in. What is the problem facing organisations when we're talking about digital inclusion at the minute? Well, the digital divide is deepening across Scotland and the UK, as access to technology and connectivity, as well as skills support, is harder in the face of a cost of living crisis. So we know that around 800,000 people in Scotland don't have any of the digital skills that they need. But not only that, 620,000 people are currently living in data poverty in Scotland, meaning they don't have access to the amount of data that they need to do their day-to-day activities. We also know that on top of this, around 59% of people across the whole UK don't have all the skills that they need for work. So there's a double disadvantage there. Not only are they potentially locked out of the job market, they are increasingly locked out of a changing job market as well. Against this background, services across the voluntary and public sectors are being stretched beyond limits. So there's not a lot of money for digital inclusion at the minute, as I'm sure everybody on the call is aware, which is kind of ironic, I guess, because digital inclusion and digital services are a bit of an obvious solution to some of the issues being faced by service users and the general population. So in fact, we know from the data that there has been an increase in Scottish voluntary sector organisations reporting concerns about digital exclusion among communities and beneficiaries over the last 6 months. So we know that the problem's not only getting worse, but the organisations aren't being given the resources that they need to counteract it. So add into the mix that kind of volatile mix as well, that everybody's looking for efficiencies. So I don't know if many of you read recently that The Guardian reported that the NHS is looking to move a third of mental health support services online. When we do something like that, who are we leaving behind? So who's losing access to their mental health support in the name of efficiency? The idea is that everybody wins when digital is an offer, but we need to help people to get there and also recognize that it's a choice. So I guess for us, this feels a little bit like a wicked problem. So without those resources, how are we able to make a difference? What I wanted to do today is talk about some of the strategic and some of the practical things that we can do as organizations to run digital inclusion services with the limited resources that we have at the minute. So the first thing I wanted to focus on was thinking about how we consider what's around. So a really good way to do that is think about asset mapping. So asset mapping is it's an important way to understand how you can deliver digital inclusion work within your scope and your means. And I guess kind of defining that, what is it that we actually mean by asset mapping is it's really a process of understanding what's available for us to use to support people to get online. And I was thinking about what's the kind of best way to talk about asset mapping? How can you do that in a way that makes sense to people? And it's really about these four things, or there are four important things to think about when we talk about asset mapping. So first off, are you going to map internally or externally or both? So are you looking to see what resources you have within your own organization, or thinking about things like expertise? So who is it within your organization that can support people or provide those digital expertise? Is it looking to see if you have any old devices that you can use, or is it even looking to see if there's a bit of spare budget kicking around? And thinking about externally as well, and we'll come on to this a bit more later as well. What's happening in your local community, and what can you access as an organization to support that aim of supporting people online? It's also really important to think about three key resources. So the three key resources that we refer to in any kind of project development is financial resources. So that's the money that you need to pay for the service that you want to run. There's human resources, so the people that are going to run the service, and the physical resources, of course. So the laptops or tablets, the Wi-Fi connections, or even the rooms and spaces that we want to deliver a service in. So it's, again, it's one of these things that you might need to get a little bit creative about when you think about what resources you have. But thinking about it in terms of those three key resources is a really good way to organize your thinking when we're talking about asset mapping. And then a thing to think about is what's missing. So not only what have you got in terms of how you map your assets, but what are you missing? So it might be that you have a great team of volunteers that want to get involved, but you don't necessarily have the space to run digital upskilling classes. Or maybe you've got a stock of old laptops and tablets, but you don't really know how to refurbish and reuse them. Identifying and being really honest about the gaps that you have is a really good way to work towards realizing those ambitions. And lastly, we'll focus on this a little bit more, is thinking about horizon scanning, so cracking out the binoculars and seeing what's happening beyond your own building. Horizon scanning is something that's really vital in understanding how you can potentially fill the gaps that you've just identified when you've been doing your asset mapping. So to focus on that a little bit more, horizon scanning is really about building that strong picture of what's happening in a local community. So it's a really good way to understand how you can work in closer collaboration with other organizations to support your goals and service users. Where there are gaps, it's more than likely that there will be someone that can help you fill it. And this happens across the voluntary sector all the time. It's all about partnership. But there are really key questions to consider when we're doing that horizon scanning and really thinking about what's in our community. And the first one is who. So who is offering the service or good that you need, and what do you know about them? Have you worked together before? Who is it that they support, and how do you work together? The second question is what. So what is the service that they offer, and how does that fit with your own gaps? So is it a good fit? Is it not a good fit? And how would that potentially work? And then there's more practical considerations like where. So is that service accessible for your service users? Is it in person? Is it online? Where is it based? And does it meet with those identified needs that you have within your service? And lastly, cost. So this is a really important one, and one where we sometimes probably fall down. So is cost going to be an issue for your service users, or is getting involved with this service going to be a cost to your own service? So lots of practical things to think about, but a really great way to structure this is, you can see on the screen there, Age UK have a horizon scanning resource, and this is part of their digital inclusion service handbook. It's a really good way to kind of structure the conversation and think about it so that you don't miss anything. What I would say is that it's really important to get as many people as you can involved in this process, because group knowledge is really key here. And we'll come back to that a little bit later as well in terms of pulling those people together. But that's your kind of asset mapping and understanding the assets and resources that are around you. But there's another element of this, which is around collaboration. So on top of asset mapping, collaboration is a really important way to deliver digital inclusion support when resources are limited. So if you've got to the point where you've mapped the assets in your organization and your community, and you know who you can work with and what you want to do, but what do you do then? And I think when we're talking about collaboration and potential partnership working, a really good first question is to think about who. So remember that partnerships only really work when they're meaningful. So are you both aligned to the same goals and values? If your partners have the same end goal as you, then the collaboration will just naturally be so much easier. In my old job, we used to say all the time, we'll work with anybody. And the thing is, we would, but it wasn't necessarily sustainable, and it wasn't necessarily always useful for our time and resources. So when you think about it, having 100 partners means having 100 different meetings about 100 different conversations that are probably the same conversation. There can be lots of confusion about roles when you have, innumerable different partners as well, and you end up not avoiding duplication in the end anyway. So it's really important to think about who is it that you want to partner with. Is it meaningful? Is it genuine? Is it worthwhile? But another really important question to ask is whether you want to move beyond your own sector as well. So are you willing to work with, for example, private sector partners? So many private sector organizations are seeking those corporate social responsibility opportunities, and some of them actually, believe it or not, and I know we don't like to say this in the public and voluntary sector, some of them are actually just good guys who have a good social conscience. So it's really important, I guess, to do your good due diligence when we're thinking about partnership, especially when moving beyond the sector. But it can pay off. And there's a really nice example of this from Greenock. So some of you might be familiar with an organisation called Belleville Community Garden. Over lockdown, they ran a device refurbishment project for community members across Greenock. Part of this, and part of what they struggled with, was identifying key partners to donate tech for them to refurbish and redistribute to members of the community. It's a really nice example about getting creative about engagement and thinking about how you identify and utilize those assets for digital inclusion as well. So as part of this project, Belleville Community Garden worked with the Inverclyde Chamber of Commerce. So what that was about was really identifying businesses and members of the business community that could donate that old technology for local people in need. And as a direct result of this partnership and this relationship, they secured donations of 120 laptops, tablets, and computers, which they were then able to use to connect people across the community. So it's really important to remember, I mean, most local authorities have those business communities and they meet as chambers of commerce, as Rotary clubs. Our role really within that is how can we tempt these kind of people to get interested and invested in digital inclusion as a cause? But thinking about how we collaborate is just as important as thinking about who we collaborate with. So the way that we run partnerships and collaborations is really important, almost as important as deciding who it is that we want to have those collaborations with. So my first point here, I guess, is really about developing collaborations that are open and insightful. So doing that can make the targeting of resources so much more efficient. Thinking about how we refer people in and where we go and who we kind of collaborate with is an important element. So don't just necessarily think about those traditionally excluded people, but maybe keep an open mind and work with organizations that you might not normally think about. Having kind of open and honest collaborations with people will really help to avoid duplication that happens across the sector all the time and really ensures that people can be reached a lot easier. So there's a nice example of this from Sterling Libraries. I think Angela might be on the call today, who launched their device lending library late last year. And it's been an absolutely phenomenal success in connecting people to the internet. So many of the people that have been referred by community partners such as women's aid organizations. So having that open process of referral and reaching out to new and different partners is a way to make sure that your service reaches as many people as it can. But lastly, thinking about the long term can have a really powerful impact for communities as well. So bringing people together, multiple partners all interested and invested in the same goal to take that strategic approach can open up a lot of new opportunities for digital inclusion. And now is when I get to use my favorite example of digital inclusion, Renfrewshire Citizen Voice. So thinking about that strategic long-term approach to digital inclusion might not sound relevant in the face of doing digital inclusion with limited resources now, but it really is about how you plan for the future and try and create a safety net for a community. So for a bit of background, Citizen Voice is a leading partnership in Renfrewshire promoting greater digital inclusion for the region. It was formed as part of our SCVO's Place-Based Digital Inclusion Programme, where partners in Renfrewshire access support from SCVO to develop a partnership and plan to support people across the local authority. Our place-based programme has worked in a number of different communities. Darren is actually our place-based lead, but we've done work in Renfrewshire, in the Borders. Mark, we did some work in Berwickshire. We've done work in Castlemilk, Dundee, and we're starting work in other parts of the country as well. But to kind of go back to Citizen Voice and my example here, what we did was bring together a cross-sector body of organisations, and that included the local authorities, so the local council, the third sector interface, local libraries, social welfare organisations, housing partners, are really just a wide variety of voices that kind of represented people from across the community. And what that did was help us understand what the problem is in Renfrewshire when it comes to digital inclusion and how kind of work more collaboratively towards solution. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying about horizon scanning. Many people around one table have such a vast stretch of knowledge. We couldn't have achieved what we did in Renfrewshire without a big number of partners. So having the space to kind of share the problems that organisations and their service users faced, facilitated by external partners who were us at SCVO, kind of enabled the group to really focus on the problems that were specific to Renfrewshire and its people. And that was really about accessing skills support and kind of knowing where you can go for digital inclusion support. So as a result, Renfrewshire Council has recruited a digital champion coordinator who is rolling out skills support across the region. They're also working on developing a trailblazing DigiZone project. So that's about making it easier for local people to access support, whether that's a Wi-Fi connection, a device, upskilling support in different parts of their community. What's really nice about Citizen Voice is even kind of 2 years down the line, they continue to meet and work together. And it really is an example of how you can develop a longer term strategic partnership for digital inclusion that doesn't necessarily eat into your organizational resources. It's something that you can refer people across to. It's about bringing community together where everybody understands that digital inclusion is everybody's responsibility and we all have a role to play. If everybody has a role to play, the resources are shared much more widely. It makes things easier and more efficient. But definitely keep an eye on Renfrewshire if you're looking for a local authority that does things well. But I guess kind of moving on from our strategic approach, thinking more practically about what we do to develop and deliver digital inclusion work when resources are tight, is really thinking about how we design our own services, our own digital inclusion projects, our own interventions. And what we have here is, I guess, kind of our top tips on how you develop and deliver or design, I guess, a service like that. So we are in a position where we are, as a sector and as practitioners, providing services with diminishing resources. This is a time where we really need to start to play to our strengths. We need to design those good services and make sure that what we do deliver is as good as it can be. So when we are designing our projects and our services, there are probably a couple of key things to keep in mind, which I'll rattle through just now. The first thing, and I think the most important thing, is ask people what they need. So make sure your service is led by your user. Don't necessarily make assumptions about what they need, but take the time to develop what people want and need through meaningful engagement. We used to hear quite often that digital inclusion projects were being started in communities where they weren't necessarily needed. So we would hear a lot from organizations saying, we've built it, but nobody's come. But what they hadn't done was that meaningful engagement behind understanding what was it that people needed. It wasn't necessarily that people in the community were looking for upskilling support, it was that they couldn't afford to pay a broadband bill. So it's really about understanding what is it that your potential service users are going to need. You don't have to change the world. So by that, we mean think about delivering small, keeping it manageable and recognizing that it takes time. These are all essential things to bear in mind. Not everything has to be huge and revolutionary and big. If you're providing support to a handful of people, you're still changing the lives of a handful of people. Really important to not overstretch yourself and your service in doing that. Thirdly, start with what you know. So start delivery within the confines of what's possible, what's within your skill set and your knowledge. And then you can use your partnerships to develop service out with your expertise. So going back to that horizon scanning that we talked about earlier, if there's something you don't know, who do you have in your community or organization that does know? Key lessons actually are here from the place-based work that I talked about just earlier. So the work that Darren does is really around finding the allies in your community that support your goals. Who are the meaningful partners that you're going to work with? And once you get all of those people into a room and have those discussions, that's when you can start to think about better coordination. So filling those gaps that you have in your service so that you don't overstretch yourself. And I guess kind of on that point as well, work out your capacity first. So be realistic in what you can achieve and how many people you can work with. Don't overwhelm your existing and available capacity. Take some time to think about how digital inclusion can fit within your current service. Make it meaningful. So this is really about how we sell digital inclusion to our bosses and our senior leaders. So when we talk about digital inclusion, we often talk about finding the hook. It's what is it going to tempt somebody online? How do we make the internet meaningful to people who don't necessarily think it's right for them? Well, we have to do the same with our chief execs and our trustees and our service leads and our bosses. We have to put it into terms that they understand. So thinking about maybe the drier business side of digital inclusion, It's the how much money you're going to save by introducing digital inclusion to your service long term. How many sessions are you going to deliver? What are the outcomes that you're going to achieve? But for anybody kind of interested in developing that conversation a little bit further, a couple of weeks ago, we had a webinar with our Director of Development, David McNeil, here at SCVO, who talked about making both the heart case and the head case. So he talked a lot about making the heart case first. So sell a story, sell the difference that digital inclusion is going to make, and then follow that up with the hard figures. So talk about the difference to somebody's lives, and then talk about how that's going to improve the business. It's really about making it meaningful, making sure you can get that investment and support that you need in the organization. And lastly, embedded throughout. So we always talk about embedded digital inclusion being the most effective type of digital inclusion. And by that, we mean your staff and volunteers are trained as digital champions, and they support your service users on a day-to-day basis with small digital nudges. It's about making digital part of the everyday and making sure that it's normalized within your service, so that when you introduce it, it doesn't feel like a big change. It's a small scale step change that happens over time. And that's really kind of how we think about designing services for digital inclusion. There's so much more to it than that, absolutely. But these are our kind of 6 top tips. All of these, I guess, have really been covered in our previous webinars, which you can find on YouTube, and I'll send out after this. But I'm just looking at the time, trying to stick to my 45-minute promise and seeing if I can do it. I wanted to move on to some even more kind of practical, quicker win type tips, because I think at the minute, that's what we need as organizations. We kind of just need people to say, how can I save some money? So just thinking about things that you've possibly already thought of before, but here are some final practical tips. Open source software is something that we can use to save us money. So we don't often think about this when we're supporting people online. We think about how are we going to help people with something like Windows or Microsoft Word. Operating systems like Chrome OS and software packages like Google Workspace are free to use. So you can avoid that expense as an organization of expensive things like Windows and Microsoft. But it is really important, obviously, to remember that these software packages work differently to ones that your service user might know or be familiar with or want to use. So considering the needs of your user will guide you to the right package. Really spending time to think about what is it that our user needs will help figure out how we can get the most cost-effective and efficient package or software for them. But always important to remember, if you're paying for something, there is probably a free version somewhere. Secondly, what's already out there? Save some time by not reinventing the wheel. So we quite often hear from organizations that want lesson plans on digital inclusion, or want to build some kind of really nice swish self-led user resource. These things already exist. They're already on the internet. So you can use things like Learn My Way and other online learning platforms. And they offer really easy, bite-size and friendly to use ways to kind of learn different digital skills. So it's not really necessarily up to you. You don't have to create those lesson plans. SCVO has just also soft launched what we call the Learner Pathway on the Connect in Scotland website. And this is a kind of hook-based tool that is pretty much a hub of really nicely curated resources for learners to access based on the things that they want to learn. So it's not about the skills, it's more about the outcomes. So it's thinking, right, I'd like to use the internet to improve my health and well-being. They click on that and it loads up resources that helps build their skills over time, but also offers really practical solutions. So whatever you're looking for is probably already out there. Thirdly, think about social tariffs. So social tariffs are not necessarily ideal, but they are a backstop for some people. We know that only between maybe 3 and 5% of eligible customers have actually claimed a social tariff. I guess for anyone that doesn't know what a social tariff is, it is a cheaper priced internet package for people on a range of benefits or low income. Training is offered around social tariffs and how to support people with social tariffs by our colleagues at the More Collective. So I will add some information on that in the follow-up email after this webinar. But a really great way to help people with digital inclusion, a really practical tip there, is make sure people are aware of them, because it could save them money and it could get them connected at a time when otherwise they wouldn't be. And talking of connection, make your Wi-Fi accessible. Even having internet that people can use can make a massive difference. So we've heard in the past from organizations that are people facing that would be otherwise great champions of embedding digital inclusion that haven't made their Wi-Fi accessible for people that need to use it. Remember, a Wi-Fi connection can be the difference between getting benefits or getting a sanction. So it really is as important as that. But there's a bigger point here as well. So you can be part of a digital inclusion solution by thinking creatively about what it is that you can offer. So maybe you've got a spare room in your building. Could you offer that to a local charity that's looking to do upskilling classes? Do you have old tech? Are you replacing all of your old laptops? Is there somewhere you can donate them so that people can get online and use them? Or is it just that warm, dry place for people to access Wi-Fi? What role is it that you can play in that digital inclusion solution without having to start from the ground up? Our next one is really thinking about resources quite practically. We know that funding is tight. Funding is really difficult right now, but you can utilize things like Funding Scotland to understand where the opportunities might be. So by this, I mean, digital inclusion isn't just about technology, it's about people first. So you can use that as an opportunity to find funding when we're thinking about social inclusion or upskilling or community cohesion. How can you fit digital inclusion into a funding application that you're already doing that's around people's skills or people's ability to access welfare, people's welfare generally? Where does digital inclusion fit with that? It doesn't have to be its own specific bid. You can embed it and cost it from there. And lastly, this is what I always like to end on because this is just the kind of person I am, but measure, celebrate, and share. So make sure that you can demonstrate the difference that you're making. Doing that is something that's going to help you build your profile and experience. And it's going to encourage trust from potential partners and funders as well. So if you have a really great digital inclusion story, if you've got a case study that you want to share, pass it to us at SCVO, because there's nothing we love more excuse me, than platforming organizations that are doing good work. Let us know. We'll stick up a blog about it. We'll put it on our Twitter. We'll stick it on the website. We love sharing the good news. So absolutely let us know. Measure the difference you're making and make a massive fuss about it as well. So that kind of brings us to the end, but I did just want to recap because I know I've chucked a lot of information at you over the last half hour. But really, there are three key takeaway messages for today. And the first is, don't just map your own assets, map all the assets for digital inclusion around you. So look around you and see what you can use to support people. It's that old saying that many hands make light work. What does the organization down the road have that you could use? And vice versa, what have you got that you can open up to the community or different organizations to support people to get online? The second is meaningful creative partnerships prompt sustainable solutions. So collaboration is key. Develop partnership where your goals are aligned and that burst you out of your silo. So particularly that kind of sector silo. Keep an open mind and think about the long term. So going back to our citizen voice reference and case study, thinking about the long-term strategic planning and creating that safety net for digital inclusion within your community. And lastly, think about how you can design your services in the most effective way. So always start with good design. How will people access your service, properly make use of it, and how will you ensure it's sustainable? I think the point is, things aren't necessarily about to get any easier. I think it's going to be a long time before the sector starts to ease up in terms of resources. What we can do is work much more collaboratively, much more openly, and with each other to try and secure some kind of change and positivity as time goes on. On that very positive note, some actual next steps, which we always like to include. And I promise it's not just us kind of shilling our services for you, but the first one really is about how can you get involved in that kind of place-based activity? So thinking about our citizen voice example, Is that something that is useful for you and your community? Then absolutely, Darren or myself would be more than happy to talk to you about that and think about how we can make that work for your community and your space. But secondly, develop that asset map. So go away and have a think about what's available for me in my organization, what's available for me in my community. Do I go wider than my community? Do I go regional? Think about what is there, who you can collaborate with, and how you can do that. But lastly, share that story, share that success. We want to hear about it, and we want to share it wider as well. What we have to do as a community of digital inclusion practitioners, enthusiasts, whatever we are, is start to shout about each other a little bit more, start to make a little bit more of a noise about some of the stories and some of the good that's happening. So if there are good stories, if there are good case studies, please send them our way because we need them and we use them all the time. I've used 2 today. But those are some practical steps. I'm just looking at that time and I think I'm doing pretty well today. So that kind of rounds us up. What I would ask just before we finish is if you can, please scan the QR code and fill in the very, very brief evaluation to let us know what you thought about today. I will send the evaluation link out after this anyway, so if you don't get a chance to use the QR code, don't worry, but we always appreciate it. Just for the last 10-15 minutes or so, I will hand back over to you guys for any questions or thoughts or observations that you want to share. And I'll stop recording for us to do that.